Look closely at this photograph. It's grainy, it's a little crooked, and the most exciting thing in the frame is a foot, a metal foot resting on red dirt, sitting perfectly still on an alien world. This is the very first clear picture ever beamed back from the surface of Mars by a mission that actually worked. And the day it was taken carries a secret written right into the calendar, because this photograph was taken on July the 20th, 1976. Now, hold on to that date for a moment. Don't look it up yet, just remember it. July 20th. There is another date 7 years earlier that history remembers a little more easily, a date involving a different kind of landing, a different kind of footprint. We'll come back to that, because what happened on Mars that day wasn't supposed to happen on that day at all. Something went wrong first. And the story of how NASA ended up here on this exact date, staring at this exact photograph, is one of the great nail-biters of the entire space age, even though almost nobody was watching it happen live. Let's set the stage, because to understand how remarkable this moment was, you have to understand just how badly humanity had failed at this before. Mars, by the mid-1970s, had a reputation. It was a spacecraft graveyard. The Soviet Union had thrown mission after mission at the Red Planet through the 1960s and early 1970s, and most of them had ended in silence, crashes, failures, probes that simply stopped transmitting. In 1971, the Soviets did manage something remarkable. Their Mars 3 lander became the first human-made object to achieve a soft landing on the Martian surface. For a moment, it looked like they'd done it. And then, after less than 20 seconds of transmission, it went dead. No usable scientific image, no meaningful surface data, just proof that a landing was possible, and a haunting reminder of how easily it could all go wrong in the very next instant. So when NASA committed to Project Viking, not one spacecraft but two, each with an orbiter and a lander, built to actually survive on the surface and do science, they were attempting something no nation had ever pulled off on Mars, a fully successful, long-duration operational landing, not just touching down, living there, working there, sending home not seconds of static but months, maybe years of real information. It was an enormous gamble, wrapped in an enormous piece of engineering, with no successful Martian precedent to lean on. Think about where America's head was in the mid-1970s. Just a few years earlier, the nation had watched Neil Armstrong step onto the moon, and for a little while anything had seemed possible. But the Apollo program was over. The public's attention was drifting, and NASA needed to prove that the era of great exploration hadn't ended with the last footprints on the lunar surface. It had just changed addresses. Mars was the obvious next chapter. Farther, harder, far less forgiving. If the moon was the front yard, Mars was the edge of the map. And 1976 wasn't just any year to make that point. It was America's 200th birthday, the bicentennial, and NASA, quite understandably, wanted a gift to give the country. So mission planners set their sights on a target that felt almost too perfect. Land Viking 1 on Mars on July 4, 1976. Independence Day. A robotic spacecraft touching down on another world on the exact anniversary of the nation's founding. It would have been one of the most poetic moments in the history of American exploration. But Mars doesn't care about our calendar. And Mars was about to remind everyone of that, in the most nerve-wracking way possible. Before we get to that twist, let's talk about just how much had to go right in the final minutes of this mission. Because this is where the story stops being about dates and starts being about pure, heart-in-your-throat engineering. Viking 1 had launched from Earth on August 20th, 1975, beginning a journey of nearly a year through deep space. By June 19th, 1976, it had settled into orbit around Mars, and the team back on Earth began the delicate work of choosing exactly where to set the lander down. Here's the problem they were up against, and it's one that's easy to miss if you've never thought about just how far away Mars really is. At that distance, a radio signal traveling at the speed of light took about 19 minutes to cross the gap between Mars and Earth. One way. Sit with that for a second. 19 minutes one way. That means if something started going wrong during the landing, and Mission Control back in California saw it happen on their screens, Their warning wouldn't even arrive at the spacecraft for another 19 minutes. And by then, the landing, successful or catastrophic, would already be old news. Viking 1 would already have been sitting on the surface, or scattered across it, for nearly 20 minutes before anyone on Earth even knew which outcome had happened. Any response sent afterward would arrive almost 40 minutes too late. There was no joystick, no abort button, no astronaut on the ground to radio home. The descent, the parachute deployment, the firing of the retro rockets, the final adjustments in the last few thousand feet above the Martian surface, every single one of those actions had to be handled by the spacecraft itself, by its onboard systems, alone, in real time, on a planet no human had ever touched. Picture the sequence. Viking 1 separates from its orbiter and begins its plunge into the thin Martian atmosphere, so much thinner than Earth's that it offered very little help in slowing the spacecraft down. A heat shield takes the brunt of the heating as the spacecraft screams downward. Then a supersonic parachute unfurls to slow the fall. And finally, in the last critical seconds, throttled retro rockets fire to ease the lander down to something survivable, not a crash, but a landing, on legs designed to absorb the shock of touching an alien world for the very first time. Every stage of that sequence had to happen at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right order, with zero opportunity for a human hand to correct a mistake. It was, in every sense, an act of trust, trust in the engineers who designed the systems, trust in the machine that would carry it out completely on its own, more than 200 million miles from anyone who could help it. Now, back to that bicentennial dream. As the Viking team studied the photographs streaming back from the orbiter, closer looks at the exact region called Chryse, where they'd planned to set the lander down on July 4th, their excitement started to curdle into concern. The images revealed channels, craters, slopes, and rough, uneven terrain that could tip the lander or damage one of its legs on touchdown. Earth-based radar raised additional fears about dangerous small-scale roughness the cameras could not resolve. What had looked from a distance like a reasonably smooth plane now looked like a gamble. And here is the thing about landing on Mars with a 19-minute communication delay: you don't get a do-over. You don't get to steer away from trouble from Earth in mid-fall. If they landed on bad ground, that was it. Mission over, in an instant, watched helplessly from more than 200 million miles away. So the team made an incredibly difficult call. They scrapped the July 4th target. They delayed the most anticipated landing in NASA post-Apollo history, gave up the poetry of the bicentennial touchdown, and instead spent precious extra days scanning the surrounding terrain from orbit and comparing it with radar observations, hunting for a patch of ground safe enough to risk everything on. It was the harder choice and the right one, because a spacecraft that becomes a monument to good timing but bad luck helps no one. Better to be quietly right than famously wrong. And so the world waited. The date everyone had been building toward came and went. July 4th, 1976 arrived, and America celebrated 200 years of independence with fireworks and parades, but not, as originally hoped, with a robot standing on Mars. Somewhere in a control room, a new date was circled instead. A backup, a second chance. Nobody in that room could afford to choose a site for the sake of an anniversary. They were thinking about rocks and slopes and whether the ground below was finally safe enough to trust. Then came the day itself, July 20th, 1976. The lander, finally cleared for its descent, separates from the orbiter and begins to fall. In mission control, there is nothing to do but watch numbers update on a screen and wait. Remember that 19-minute delay. This is where it becomes almost unbearable. The entire landing sequence, the atmospheric entry, the parachute, the retro rockets, the touchdown itself happens, start to finish, in about 7 minutes. And every one of those minutes has already happened and finished, one way or another, long before the signals describing it reach Earth. The room isn't watching a landing as it happens. The room is watching the past, arriving in slow motion, with no way of knowing yet whether it's about to celebrate or grieve. Somewhere out there, Viking 1 is already either resting safely on Martian soil or it is not, and there is nothing anyone on Earth can do but count the minutes and wait for the truth to arrive. The clock ticks. The room holds its breath. And then the signal arrives. Confirmation. Viking 1 is down, safe, intact, on the surface of Mars. And once the cheering starts, once the disbelief and the relief wash over the room, the coincidence becomes impossible to miss. The date is July 20th, 7 years to the very day since Apollo 11 touched down on the moon and Neil Armstrong took humanity's first steps on another world. The delay had been forced by concerns about the terrain and the painstaking search for a safer site, not by the original bicentennial plan. And yet here it was, America's first successful landing on another planet, falling on the exact anniversary of America's first crewed landing on another world. The bicentennial date had slipped away, and in its place, the universe, or plain coincidence, had handed them something almost as poetic. NASA hadn't originally planned it, but NASA and the watching world were more than happy to notice it, to marvel at it, and to let that echo of July 20th become part of the story people told for decades afterward. Beginning just 25 seconds after touchdown, Viking 1 did something no successful mission had ever done from the surface of Mars. It began taking a picture, and engineers, still not entirely believing their own instruments, had programmed the camera to begin with the simplest, most reassuring subject imaginable, one of the lander's own footpads, resting undamaged on the Martian ground. That grainy, unglamorous photograph of a metal foot on rocky soil was, in its own way, one of the most important images of the decade. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It was proof. Proof that the machine had survived, that the ground beneath it was solid, that everything, the 19-minute blind descent, the autonomous systems, the scrapped Independence daydream, the painstaking search for safer ground, had actually worked. Viking 1 then continued scanning outward, capturing rocks, dust, and eventually a broad panorama of a rust-colored, rock-strewn landscape that no living creature from Earth had ever seen with its own eyes. A new world, suddenly made real one photograph at a time. Viking 1 had been built to survive on Mars for at least 90 days. That was the lander's planned mission lifetime, 90 days of data, and then, if it lasted longer, a bonus. Instead, that little lander kept working, kept transmitting, kept sending home weather reports and soil analyses and photographs of the Martian landscape for more than 6 years, finally falling silent in November of 1982 after an erroneous command caused the loss of contact. 6 years, from a machine designed for 90 days. That's not just luck. That's what happens when engineers build something with the assumption that it has to work perfectly the first time, with no one there to fix it, and then build in enough margin to keep working long after anyone expected it to. So when you look at that first grainy photograph of a footpad on Martian soil, you're not just looking at a historic image. You're looking at the payoff of a story with real tension in it. A team that gave up its perfect, poetic date rather than gamble on unsafe ground. That trusted a machine to carry out a landing across a gap too vast for human reflexes to cross. And that ended up, almost by accident, matching one of the proudest dates in American history without originally chasing it on purpose. July 20th, 1969, humanity's first footprints on the moon. July 20th, 1976, America's first successful, lasting foothold on Mars. 2 landings 7 years apart, joined by a date born from caution and remembered by everybody. 50 years on from that second July 20th, it's worth remembering what actually made it remarkable, not a tribute in the original plan, but a delay someone was brave enough to choose, and a coincidence the universe handed back in return. That's the real story of Viking 1. Not perfection by design, but caution, patience, and quiet nerve, rewarded in a way nobody could have scripted. And somewhere out past the moon, past the edge of what Apollo ever reached, that same spirit of reaching just a little farther than the last time is still out there, still guiding the next generation toward the next unwritten date on the calendar, waiting, once again, to be discovered.